start to consider all of the information that has been shared with us from our submitters and deliberate on some of the concerns and issues that have been raised. So the process from here is, in a moment, I'll invite Gary to come up and just give a brief sort of report on primarily the more recent officer's recommendation included in your agenda, and then the intention is to essentially compile a list up on the whiteboard that Deputy Mayor Brosnan found for us of the issues that each of us have identified throughout this submission process, and we'll work through that so that we've got a bit of a plan to guide us through our deliberations. We will be finishing at 5 o'clock today. It has been a long day with our committee meetings this morning, and so obviously if we've not reached a conclusion, we'll be adjourning back here tomorrow morning. And I guess just a very early heads up as well, if we do require some additional modelling and information in response to some of our discussion today, it may well be that we actually have to adjourn to a future date, because I'm sure you would all agree that it is really important that we consider all our options here and get the right outcome for our community. So on that note, I would like to invite Gary up to talk to his report.
Good afternoon, everybody. So, knowing the magnitude of the work ahead, the Revenue and Financing Policy Review was commenced in 2018. There was considerable debate and discussion by the councillors about different options which were considered and rating models produced to analyse the impact on the public. Some older methods were no longer available, and hard decisions had to be made on how to finance the city and how rates would be impacted. Timing of the review has been critical, as it needs to be completed before work commences in earnest on the long-term plan. However, the task has been hampered twice by lockdown and recent flooding. The report being presented today is a product of those years of review and recent public consultation. Discussions at the public meetings and some of the feedback has been understandably heated, as there are parts of the community potentially facing large increases in their rates. The challenge all along has been trying to establish a balance. There are always going to be outliers or pockets that see significant change. The nature of property can be diverse. However, we can't forget that general rates are a tax on land to fund the public good. Not the good immediately outside of our front gate, but the good of the entire community. Given the scope of this work and the fact that it impacts everyone, considerable effort was put into engaging with the city. Media releases through print, on radio and in social media were placed. Letters were sent to the entire community advising the proposal, with additional letters sent to those most negatively impacted. We had 6 community meetings to lay out the proposal, and this was a difficult task given the size and complexity of the proposal. At the close of the consultation, 540 submissions were received, and from what I understand, this is a high number. Most of those responses, about 63%, came from the areas most negatively impacted. Based on the location of respondents, a bit over 52% disagreed with the funding model. Almost 62% disagreed with reducing the number of differentials from 6 to 3, and 66% disagreed with proposed changes to how general rates and targeted rates are assessed. You have the recommendations in front of you, so I won't address those in any detail. I will, however, note the officer's recommendations around differentials and general rates. A common theme from responses was that the increase in general rates wasn't fair in rural areas, as they weren't getting increased services. On that point, I can't stress enough that they aren't just paying for those, they're paying for the services that everybody receives, no more. Where water, sewerage, rubbish and other services are provided, those properties get charged an additional targeted rate. That said, Council does try to strike a balance. In analysing those properties most impacted, water and sewerage were common factors. Rural properties seldom have both. We understand that there are costs in setting up and maintaining infrastructure on lifestyle blocks where those services are not available. To recognise the distinction between these and residential properties, we have recommended the introduction of a semi-rural differential with a general rate set halfway between rural and residential. Rural properties rely on their land to generate income. Semi-rural properties generally do not. Those that do rely on their property for income, though, through agricultural activities, would have a remission available to them. At 92.5%, most semi-rural properties or owners would see a reduction of several $100s compared to the original proposal. To fit into this category, properties must not have reasonable access to both water and sewerage. Should that condition change, those properties would be rated as residential. This recommendation would impact approximately 1,600 properties in Miani, Jervoistown, Paraiti and Greater Bayview. So regarding the remainder of the proposal, we maintain those recommendations as originally published. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Gary. And I would just like to comment on the recommendation around the introduction of a semi-rural differential. And I think that this is potentially the most complex part of our deliberations with regards to the proposal. And just to advise that staff are currently doing some further modelling around what that differential might look like. And I guess just to reiterate that a large component of these general rates is directly related to those common good and community assets and facilities that everybody has access to. But from my perspective, and I'm very keen to hear others' thoughts on this as well, the relevance of having a semi-rural differential is in recognition of the fact that these communities do not have the likes of street lighting, of footpaths, channel and curbing, and other services that parts of our more inner city communities do have. So that for me is the reason that I am very interested in seeing some further modelling done on what that percentage would land at for that semi-rural differential, and would like to open up if others would like to provide some comment on that, bearing in mind that we won't be in a position to make a final decision on this until we have the results of that modelling come through.
Can I just have a quick rundown on it again, please?
Sure.
Just a brief one.
On the semi-rural proposal?
Yeah.
All right, so for those properties, taking a look at the sort of wider, well, generally rural network of properties, a common theme was that a lot of them don't have access to water or sewerage. So often they may have things such as rubbish and recycling available, but still not those things. And so we look to take that as a measure of looking at what the impact would be if we created that semi-rural differential. And so with that, as I was saying, there's approximately 1,600 properties, and that encapsulates actually most of the most significantly impacted properties within this proposal, sort of, as I was saying, Paraiti, Miani, Jervoistown, and sort of Greater Bayview as well. So with that differential, if they don't have and do not reasonably have access to both water and sewerage, then they'd fit into that fourth category of semi-rural. So
they would need to have access or reasonable access to both?
To both, that's right.
Okay.
And so, sorry if you don't mind me expanding on that a little bit.
No.
And so, for instance, if we look at areas such as Bayview, where they do have water, but they've got their own sewerage, and they may not have, full roading, they don't have curbs or footpaths, then they would fit into this reduced differential. Parts of Jervoistown and Miani, that's certainly the case, where they're so far away from this infrastructure that they can't reasonably be connected to it. And it is an easy way to differentiate between the two.
Mm-hmm.
Just for an example then, Ferguson Drive in Bayview, Ferguson Road. What has that got?
Only water.
Only water, so
Only
they
water.
would be eligible.
Yes.
Absolutely. There's only a small
Yes.
portion of Bayview that would be considered as residential because they have full services.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gary.
Yeah, I know I didn't use my speaker. Thanks, everybody.
Can you say it again?
Councillor Simpson, you look like you're setting yourself up.
Yeah, through you, Madam Chair. Probably one of the things we've tried to do is simplify things, but I think the titling and descriptors of our differentials are a confusing factor. We've introduced a new one called semi-rural. Well, what does that mean? And I wonder whether we could simplify it. We know that we've got urban residential, and we know that we've got urban commercial and industrial. Why don't we simply call them rural residential, where the property is primarily used for residential purposes? And why don't we have rural commercial industrial, where the property has some commercial activity? Why can't we just simplify it so that people can clearly understand where they fit? Because that then gives us a benchmark of being able to talk parallels.
Yeah, I welcome people's thoughts on that. I think that's a good suggestion. Councillor Crown.
Yeah, through you, Madam Chair. Yeah, I absolutely agree with Councillor Simpson. I think it's been really evident throughout the submission process that there is a lot of confusion around the language that we use and sort of especially between the rating system and the district plan. So in order to make things far easier for people to understand, I think renaming the categories, the differentials, makes a heck of a lot of sense.
And supplementary, Madam Chair, if I may, just to follow on from that point, I think that's the other factor that's really confusing, is the disconnect between our rating classifications and our district plan classifications. And we actually have a perfect opportunity in this parallel process to line those things up to make things really simple.
I agree, absolutely. Okay, so just in terms of the suggestion that's been made by Councillor Simpson with renaming those the rural residential and the rural commercial industrial, is that language that we think fairly represents the categories that we're and would be easy for people to understand? And we don't necessarily need to land on this right now, but I guess it's just indicating that let's find some really good, clear and easy to understand language to define those categories when we do. Councillor Crystal? Yep.
One of the submitters did it quite well when he called it limited services. And that was I thought that was quite a good description at limited services. Yeah.
Okay. Councillor Brown?
I quite like the rural commercial element as well, because that would essentially be including another differential, which would cover places like the Miani Hotel, because the thing I was struggling with the commercial perspective is that we're charging them more because they're an extra burden on the services, but that one didn't seem to fit the mould, so maybe that would alleviate that problem as well.
Deputy Mayor.
Yeah, just a thought from me. I think with the national standards around the naming in the district plan, I think we're almost buying a fight if we try and make them exactly the same, because through the district plan there may be 15 different zones namings, for instance, that we end up with, and that's not the number of differentials we want to go with, and so naturally we might have a bit of confusion anyway. So I like the suggestion. We've got our residential other, we've got our commercial and industrial. I liked limited services rather than rural residential, and I like the suggestion of rural and rural commercial. And then just noting as well that we may need to introduce a fifth, being our utilities.
Yeah. Okay, so I think if we perhaps just park this for the moment for staff to consider some of the suggestions that have been made in terms of the naming convention, and with the issue that was raised initially around the differential for, let's just call it semi-rural for now because that's what's in the paper, I guess I want to just get a read from the councillors as to your level of comfort with the definition of those types of properties, being that it is a property that currently is connected or can reasonably easily be connected to both of the water services, and that would be, anything sitting outside of that would fall within that new category.
Point of clarification, you mean could not easily be connected?
So,
thank you.
Yeah, that's why I said it would sit outside of that,
And can we run through the full definition, because there's a sizing component to that,
Okay.
those properties as well?
Yep.
Gary?
Okay.
And while Gary's just looking for that information, Your Worship, I wouldn't mind hearing from our officers where a tiny house or an off-the-grid house fits within these differentials. So, which is a valid option for building going forward. And I know we've got a couple of people that have got container homes and the like in our district or our area. Where do they fit within these differentials? So, just wondering. I just saw a gap and I didn't see them represented.
Yeah, I think, okay, we'll just hold that thought. We'll get this definition out on the table for everyone to consider.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So the definition I've provided in the most recent report is any property that is not defined as commercial and industrial or rural and would otherwise be defined as residential other, but is not connected and cannot reasonably be connected to city water and sewage system is defined as semi-rural.
And is there, as the Deputy Mayor just mentioned, is there any size or land area included in that definition?
No, there's no size.
No. So therefore, I think that definition would cover probably the question that you've just asked, Councillor Tapani, because are you referring to these properties that are more likely to be
Off the grid
and not connected?
Within our boundaries.
Yes, but not connected to services.
Correct.
Yeah. So I think they would be covered by that differential.
Cool.
Yeah. Okay, so Councillor Wright.
Just clarifying, didn't we talk about rural residential? Or is that the rural category that's up there now?
Limited services.
Or limited
So it's
services.
limited services.
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
Covers both rural and
Or
residential.
rural residential.
One of those. Yeah.
Just while we're discussing, Your Worship, the definition, I'm just conscious, and I don't necessarily see it as an issue, but wanted to highlight it, that we're discounting the general rate for limited services or rural residential properties on a definition based on the connection to services, but our discount is not related to the provision of those services. It's related to infrastructure, roading, footpaths, lighting. Just wanted to raise that.
And I think that's something that we can ponder on. I don't necessarily think that it's an issue, but it's a valid point to
whether
raise.
it could become an issue, I suppose, just
That's
the
right.
thinking.
So whether we do need to consider that the definition is more based on the services that these properties don't receive with regards to streetlights, footpaths, channel and curbing, although that might start to get quite
more
complex.
complicated. So I was just raising it
just
for thought.
flagging it. Yeah, no,
True.
definitely.
It certainly will if someone makes a comparison to the hill.
Yeah.
Yes,
Through you,
with
Madam.
perhaps no footpaths and to some degree some limited lighting.
yes, yeah.
Through you, Madam Chair, isn't not, though, the principal use of the property? In other words, if the property, regardless of size, and I think it's where we have to be really careful because there's some very large properties where their sole purpose is actually residential. They've just got immaculate gardens, or not. But they're being, in some cases, in some of our documentation, being classified as being over or under a certain size as to whether they're classified as one thing or another. And I think what we need to be really clear on is what is the principal purpose of that property. Is it primarily a residential property or is it a commercial property? And what the way we can define that, because then that comes back to the definition of what services are they likely to be using. Do they have the opportunity to use the library and the pool and because of the nature of their occupancy versus are they commercial or industrial where it's simply a staff function of producing outputs? And I think that's something we need to consider.
I agree, and I think that is already quite clearly defined within the existing proposal. So where I see this definition and this new differential is around recognising those residential and commercial properties that are not receiving those full suite of services, specifically the streetlights, footpaths, etc., but obviously in the case of residential ratepayers, they do have access to the library and the pools and the public toilets, etc. So that's where I see that lying.
Just through the chair, also notwithstanding the fact that Napier is actually quite small, so I dare say that most people in Napier would have access to those services without getting too complex.
That's right, and I think it came through quite clearly through the submitters that they did not have an issue with paying for their fair share of those community facilities, and it really was more around those things right by their property that they didn't have in Bayview and Parati and Jervoistown that we do have on the whole in town, recognising that the hill, for example, often doesn't have footpaths, but it is complex and we're never going to find a one-size-fits-all. But I certainly feel that we do have a consensus that we need to recognise those properties that have the limited services, if we wanted to use that language. Councillor Bogue.
Just commercial and industrial also is valid and would be put on that list as well. I haven't got it up there.
Yep. So just to summarise in terms of the consideration of this differential, we have a definition that's been proposed to use as the basis for who would sit within the differential. We've got staff doing some additional modelling to find what would be a fair and reasonable percentage to apply to that differential, and that will be brought back to us. So before we move on and actually compile a list of the other issues that I'd like us to deliberate on today, is there anything else with regards to that specifically that anyone would like to discuss? Councillor Brown.
I'd just like to add in the modelling. I was interested in the submission today where I was talking about how the average price of a rural property was significantly higher than the average price of a urban property. And I was wondering if that could be looked at as, cause obviously percentage-wise we would be asking them to get a bit of a discount, but what does that mean in actual value of rates comparatively? So I was wondering if that could be added in as some information when the modelling comes back.
Okay, so, sorry, through you, Madam Mayor. Just to clarify then, looking at those larger properties, are you saying just the average sort of rates that they would pay and the impact of that as an average? Because the reason I ask that is that the property is so diverse that it can be difficult to say what a reasonable average is. But if that's what you're asking, then we can certainly do that.
I think in my head what the ideal report would look like is sort of almost like a bell curve of how much so two bell curves of how much it costs, but not a particularly defined one, so it can be a pretty chunky bar graph of, I can talk to you about it offline.
Okay, so if everyone's happy, we will park that for either tomorrow or a future date and pull together a list of the other considerations and issues that have been raised over the last 3 days and through the written submissions and work our way through those. So I have a few jotted down here that we'll start off with, and then I'll open up for others to add to that. Does it flip around, Adele, or is it not? Okay. So I would like us to consider the phasing of the proposed changes over 3 years.
Yep.
Having a look at the proposed commercial differential of 250%. Looking at the utilities or the reintroduction of a utilities differential to address the stormwater anomaly. You probably don't need to write all of that. Utilities differential will be enough. The proposal of 70% charge for city water and sewerage rate for those not connected. I'm just trying to think how to make it in a short summary for you. Yeah. Consideration of remission for development land. A discussion around the current provisions for small businesses operating from a dwelling. And having a discussion around the UAGC. And we'll open up for any further items to be added. Councillor Crystal.
I have a question about the Bayview people on meters. I know they've got meters, but why do they have to pay the extra money if they go over their allowance?
Okay. Yep, we'll have a look at that.
Because they're paying the same as the $262. But I just wondered, is that something historical, or could that be something that is looked at?
Okay.
And it's not just Bayview, because I know Oak Road and Taradale and stuff also
And
have the same thing.
The new development,
Yeah.
I can't recall the
T-
name. Taroda.
Yeah.
I think they have
Some of
that
Taradale
as
do
well.
too.
Yes. Councillor Bogue.
Could we, after hearing 3 days of submissions, which were very critical of our proposals, could we actually have a good look at the status quo and why we are moving from that? Just to be clear on that commitment.
Councillor Simpson.
I'm wondering, because of the way things have changed, and I think part of the context we're dealing with is that when a lot of these, particularly rural properties, bought their properties, they were unattractive, had low values. Property values in the rural area have gone up about 1,000% in the last decade. And that's no fault of the owners, that's just simply the fact that for some reason those properties have now become attractive, which means that when we use land value as our basis of divvying up the general rate, it means that there's an equitable share goes to those ratepayers. I wonder whether we need to look at some of our general rates as to whether some of those things should become fixed charges.
So separating out some of those services that sit within the general rate to become a targeted rate.
Yep.
So review that.
So something simple there, and a simple example, we know how much it costs us to operate the libraries. If we're saying everyone should share that cost, then turn it into a fixed rate and charge everyone the same rate.
Deputy Mayor Brosnan.
Your list was very comprehensive, Your Worship. The only one I had that was additional to that is the development of the remission for the significant natural areas. I'd like to confirm that.
Councillor Crystal, then Councillor Bogue, then Councillor Brown.
There's something that Councillor Crown and I spoke to Gary about yesterday, which I think would be really interesting for everyone to hear about, because there was a lot of talk about the revaluation and the effect it's going to, in a lot of people's calculations were working out their property's gone up 25%, so their rates are going to go up 25%, whereas Gary was explaining to us that the average rate rise in Napier is 45?
Yeah, 45.
45. So if your property hasn't gone up by 45%, it will not affect your rates at all. Have I said that right? Well,
Close.
yeah, close. And the most affected group is the commercial and industrial. Yes.
Your Worship, I just wonder if, actually, because we're obviously live streamed, it might be helpful to have a bit of a clearing up of some of the misconceptions that we heard. You know, if a few, I think Councillor Crown alluded to it with the wastewater and water, just a bit of a conversation at the start around what we're actually proposing and what we're not proposing as well might be helpful along those similar lines. Just an overview.
We could certainly do that. I just think if we compile our list so that we don't lose anything that people might have just in their mind at the moment, and then we could cover off on clarifying some of those, what's sitting within the current proposal, and certainly around the revaluation process and the impact that has on people's rates. So, Councillor Bogue?
Yes, the unfavourable comparisons that were made with Hastings. I did ask Gary about this yesterday, and he's able to explain that to us. People on the same street, paying a lot more than Hastings over the road.
Great. Yeah, so I think as we work through this list, a lot of those clarifying of areas will actually fall out of this conversation as well. Councillor Brown.
Thank you. This one relates to Paul Harris's submission, where he was talking about providing potentially a remission for properties that are developed but are providing their own water. So it kind of relates to number 4, but
Incentivising.
Councillor Price.
Some modelling on the increasing of the UAGC.
Okay, yep. So we've got UAGC up there.
Yeah. Sorry. We do it twice.
Okay, so I think obviously if anyone thinks of anything during the course of deliberations, we can add to the list. And I do think it would be really useful, perhaps, Gary, at this point, if you did want to provide some explanation around the impact of the revaluations on properties, to provide some further clarity on that for anyone that may be currently watching the live stream.
Of course. Thank you, Madam Mayor. So, something that has been touched on several times by submitters over the last few days is that revaluation of property in New Zealand has increased significantly in this 3-year period. There's been a number of factors, but for Napier, the average land value increase is about 44.5%, which is quite significant. Within that, we have some outliers. Land value for commercial is at 76.2%, and industrial is at 84.4%. So what that means at 44.5% is that although some of the submitters thought that their properties might be going up by an additional 35%, that's not necessarily the case. With the nature of rates, they're all interconnected. So because the value of your property goes up, it doesn't mean that the council is looking to take more money. So each year, a certain amount is set in terms of rates take to fund and manage the city. So within that, your property, relative to others, if it increases above the average, may pay a bit more. If it increases below the average, will pay less relative to what the current rate is, because of that interconnectedness. So for lifestyle properties, the average increase for land value is 49.2%. So it's about a 5% increase relative to the overall increase. I can go on if you'd like, but does that explain it?
So essentially it is a redistribution across the different suburbs within our community, depending where they sit with the average increase across. So it's similar to the exercise we're doing here. Rather than an increase in total tax rating take overall, it's redistributing amongst the various suburbs.
That's correct. And if I just might add as well, something that I'd advise with caution is creating policy based on a revaluation over 3 years. The rate policy or the decision on that should be a long-term view, whereas in 3 years' time, we may see the inverse. It could be that industrial and commercial property declines in value or doesn't go up as much by the average, and so we have to be careful of that short-term thinking when establishing or developing policy.
Does anyone have any further questions with regards to that specific? I think it would also be useful for us to have a bit of a conversation around the land value versus capital value versus, I think there is a third hybrid type option, but I don't know if any council in the country uses that. But the fact that we only have those three options to use, and the basis for our decision at this point in time, in terms of the current proposal, to retain the land value option as opposed to moving to capital value. So I don't know if you have any particular comments that you'd like to make on that, Gary.
I can provide a little bit of clarity for anybody else who's listening, also just to help explain. So the third category, I'm trying to remember off the top of my head what it's called. It's essentially related to the rentable value of the property. It's a confusing mess and nobody uses it. The two most common ones are land value and capital value. Capital value is the most common approach to valuing general rates across New Zealand. So land value is the unimproved value of the land, so just the base dirt. In theory, you could have two similar sized properties. One has a hotel on it, the other one's a bare section, and they may in fact have the same land value. Capital value is the land value plus improvements. So it will be the building. If it's a vineyard, it'll be the vines, or an orchard, it will be the trees. So that's why a lot of councils use that. They believe it's a more accurate measure or a way of assessing rates. So at the moment, obviously, Napier City Council uses land value.
And we did during one of our, or several of our 14 workshops, discuss the option of moving to capital value, and essentially for my recollection of the decision not to do so was that we were already proposing so many changes that we felt it was just a bridge too far to also make that very, very significant change of shifting to capital value. If anyone else has any other comments they'd like to add in terms of how we discuss that, then Councillor Wright.
Just if we decide not to talk about capital value now, when would be the next opportunity for us to put that back on the table to have a look at it? Because I think that we're one of the outlier councils that are still working off land value, and I think we need to get our eyes on capital value again at some point in the future. And I agree with you, it might be a bridge too far right now, but we should have a plan for reviewing that and going out to our community with that in the near future. So when would be the next opportunity?
And I can probably answer that in through the Mayor. Council can make the decision about when it might like to consider that. So although there's a in legislation it says recommends to review your policy every 6 years, Council can make the decision to go back on that earlier than that.
So we could actually indicate at this point in time that we would like to relook at that in 3 years' time. Or any other such time frame as anyone would like to propose.
Can I ask another question? Yeah. Would it be best to review that then in line with the next LTP, or would it be better to do that before it or after it? Because that would help us with our timing.
And through the Mayor, there's going to be pros and cons on all of that. So there's lots of other changes that are potentially happening in local government as well. So I think we could come back to you with what the advantages and disadvantages are around the timing, provide you some more information about when that decision could be made.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Okay, I'll open up, and if there's other areas that people would like to raise that they think would be good for us to seek some further clarification before we start moving through the list, then we could take that time now. No. Councillor Brown.
I think we've covered it quite well, but just reassurance again for the public that the changes in the naming of the differentials doesn't change any of the property use rights, and that's separate in the district plan review.
Yeah. Councillor Bogue.
Could we at some stage fairly early on talk about what we did get agreement from the submitters on? Because there were some aspects that many of them agreed with, and I think it would be helpful as a starting point, perhaps, or fairly early on, to discuss the things that the submitters were okay with that we'd put in the proposal.
Councillor Mawson.
Just through you, Madam Mayor, just probably if Gary could please explain a little bit about property values. There'll be a lot of the ratepayers that actually weren't at some of the public meetings, and they might maybe like to find out a little bit more about how certain properties are paying a little bit more rates relative to where they are due to their land, in the sense that, for instance, my properties are quite a small property, and some of the submitters made reference to how their property rates were going up. They've got much bigger properties than I do, and I pay a lot more rates.
Through you, Madam Mayor, that's a very long answer. I'll try to shorten it. Something which I tried to communicate at some of the meetings, and I didn't get across very well. It was quite challenging. Is that when it comes to land values, there are a number of factors that come into play in constructing that land value. But a lot of it can be summed up by saying the relative desirability of that land, the area. So it could be things such as the distance or accessibility of services. So somewhere in town, which is close to shops and everything else, it's got roads and street lights and good internet, will typically have a higher weighting in terms of value than one that's far removed out in the country. It could also be the cost of servicing and looking after that property as well. And so that's something that has in the past reduced the value of lifestyle properties, in that it does cost a lot to put in sewerage and water and to maintain it on an ongoing basis. And that's why, people often jokingly refer to it as a life sentence block. There's a lot of work in that. But of late, we've seen greater demand and a greater view of desirability for those particular places, which has seen the value go up. And so that's why we may see that a smaller property in town can have a relative, or close to a relative land value of one that's larger and outside of town for those reasons, for that perceived desirability. I hope that answers the question. I can go on, but
It's good, thank you.
It was good. Thank you. Okay, I think if we start working through the list, and then obviously as the conversation evolves, I'm sure there'll be other things that come to light. And
It won't take long.
that's what I was thinking. I'm trying to think of what there was that they were happy with.
Rates remission policy.
Could I speak to that?
You can.
I actually really like the idea from Councillor Simpson, which I think is up on the board and speaks to this agreement on what submitters were happy with. They were all happy to pay for our pools, our libraries, our cemeteries, our parks and reserves, those sorts of things. And whilst the example from Councillor Simpson was pull out libraries, I think you used, actually we could probably pull out a group of community facilities like that, show that separately on the rates, and show everyone's equal contribution to those. And I think we saw that in the submissions that everyone agreed. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you're suggesting that we're actually more explicit in the way that we define that general rate that everybody pays the same for and what that covers?
Yeah, I think it would be an interesting exercise potentially for us. I know Gary's done some work in pulling out for me the numbers on what the infrastructure component of the general rate was, and that was 34% off the top of my memories. But if you could split the general rate into a component that showed all of those, which might be 60% of the current general rate, and classify that and show that differently, I think, there was a lot of agreement around funding equally those services.
So I guess to take that a little bit further, that I believe ties in with the work and the modelling that we're doing around the limited services option. So essentially, at the moment, the general rate also includes the likes of street lighting, footpaths, curb and channelling. So what we're saying is we pull out those common good community facilities portion of the general rate, which is then applied equally across all ratepayers, and that will essentially leave those balance of services that not all properties have the same amount of access to. So that will fall out of the modelling that's being undertaken. Would that be is that essentially what you're...
Yeah, essentially those undeniable equal access
Yep.
facilities. Yeah.
Yep. Councillor Crystal?
Isn't that the UAGC? Not? Because that's a fixed amount for everybody though, isn't it? Yeah.
Sorry, through you, Madam Mayor. Just first off, when it comes to splitting out some of these costs, we have the annual report and the annual plan. It does detail how general rates and how rates are spent and the proportion of each, and it's something I do recommend a lot of the public do look at to get greater reference or greater understanding of how that is allocated. When it comes to the UAGC, the Uniform Annual General Charge, that is a component of the general rate. So you've got the variable component and the fixed component. When it comes to these fixed costs, we can go up to a maximum of 30%. Typically, we like to keep it at around about 20% so that we do have the ability to move, and also if there are any other adjustments that go on, we don't breach that 30% limit.
But that UAGC isn't necessarily tagged specifically to those common community facilities.
It's a component of the general rate,
Yes.
so for general charges.
Yeah. Okay.
Is it the potential to get a bit confusing? 'Cause
Yeah.
You're going to have the general rate and the UAGC, and then you're going to have specified rates. What did you say, Nigel? Your libraries and etc. So this is going to get a bit confusing. That's what you're sort of saying, isn't it?
I would suggest, through you, Madam Chair, that it actually becomes more transparent.
And yeah, just to follow on from that, I think we've, through reading through all the submissions and hearing from the people over the last 3 days, I think it's quite clear that this is very confusing. We've had a number of workshops, etc. And there's so much jargon, there's so many different things to consider, etc. I think the more transparent we can be about how we're allocating that income against certain categories, if we bunch things together, or specific services, I think that it will help our community to better understand what their money is going towards. So yeah, I think that it's about how we group, how we explain, and the devil will be in the detail of that.
Councillor Price.
Transparency is, I think we should be, but what I'm saying is you specify a whole lot, and then your UAGC is not transparent, and it's a figure there that, what's it used for?
Through you,
That's
Madam
why
Chair,
to see-
the UAGC is a component of what would be left of your general rate. So you deduct out all of the fixed charges, anything that we can identify where we can identify a fixed annual charge that would have previously been hidden within the general rate. Whatever is then left over, the items we need for a bit more flexibility around how we strike rate, that general rate component would reduce. The UAGC is still only up to a 30% component of what is left of the general rate.
Yeah, I fully understand that, but then people are going to say, well, what's that spent on then, the UAGC? Because you spent it all on your libraries. There's an area here that you're not explaining. That's where I get a bit...
Isn't that an ideal world?
It's not transparent to me.
It is when we have to start explaining it.
Would we have the opportunity to report on that as an annual plan, or I don't know, annual report?
The UAGC specifically?
I'm just trying to find a solution to,
I don't believe it's.
Yeah, just through the Mayor. So at the moment we are reporting, we used to sort of show for every dollar where the rates dollar was spent. If you remember, when we've now got a sort of a nice graph which shows, the mix of the pie and where we spend our rates funding as a community as a whole. So what we're just looking for is probably a little bit more definition around what that general rate is made up with, and then when we're looking for that limited category that you're looking for, we can then say, well, it excludes this for this reasons, and then that means that you get a reduction in your overarching rate, and that's why you've got a discount on your rates. Yeah.
Is that is this a related question, Councillor Brown? Yep.
I think I'm picking up a slight difference in between what Councillor Simpson's recommending and potentially what Councillor Brosnan was, in terms of, if we separate it out in the rates, are we going to do it on the graduated land value scale, or is it going to be a fixed cost? Because that's essentially increasing your UAGC by making it a fixed cost, is what Councillor Simpson's offering. Whereas I thought that one of the themes that came through from the submitters is that they were happy to pay for services so long as they felt like they got value for money. So when they saw the value, I think if we can increase the communication around what's in our rates, even if someone next door pays more for the library, but they've got equal access to me, I got the feeling from a lot of submitters that they would be okay with that because they understood that it is essentially a wealth tax and it's based off your land value. I think there's a detail there that we need to work out, whether we're talking fixed costs, which is equal for everybody, or a cost that is an equal percentage for everybody for things like the library.
Right, I'm not quite sure I'm following you there. Sorry, Councillor Brown, but
do you get it? So I think either everyone pays, I'll make up a number, $200 for access to the library, or everyone pays 2% of their rates for access to the library.
So I thought we were all in agreement that essentially we are talking about it's that percentage which sits within the general rate as of their land value, and then separate to that is the UAGC, which is just a flat fixed cost across all ratepayers.
That's not my understanding of Councillor Simpson's suggestion.
Certainly my aim would be to be saying anything that is currently in the general rate, because it's the general rate that is dispersed by land value, anything that we can identify a fixed, equitable, because I think our statement was, do you think similar properties should pay similar rates? But the same should apply. Do you think similar users should pay for the similar service? So why should one ratepayer, because they have a higher value property, in this case predominantly our 2,500 rural properties that are getting a bit of a hit, why should they pay more to use the library than someone in town?
Is that what you were proposing, Deputy Mayor? Because I think you were talking about the opposite.
I think you have picked up on a discrepancy. I was probably thinking, inherently, I think, was thinking that it would be weighted on the same scale as what the current general rate was. And I think I agree with everything you've just said, Councillor Simpson. It's just that we have no other mechanism other than land value to appropriate those costs. A two-bedroom house in the back of Taradale sitting on a block of flats, should that pay the same as a 5-bedroom something sitting on the hill or sitting in Jervois Town? And land value is the only way that you discriminate, between the two.
Someone with a larger, a more expensive property is going to use the library more than someone with a lesser value property. Is that what you're suggesting?
Potentially, if there's more people living in that property, there will be more people accessing those facilities. And I think what this clearly highlights is there's no perfect answer.
Exactly right.
Can I just add through the Mayor? So this, the way in which we can rate is actually governed by the Rating Act 2002. And so every council faces these same issues, and so we might identify that about 50% of our costs, we can work out who might actually get access to those services, but we're actually governed that we can only cap at that 30%. So at some point you're going to be into that change mode of whether you have to then apportion that based on land or apportion it based on capital. And at the moment we're apportioning based on land. But the issue is that it's governed by the Rating Act, and so we can't actually step outside that framework.
Yep. So to summarise, I think that what we're essentially proposing here, taking it back to an analysis of the general rate whereby we've had agreement from submitters that they are happy to pay their equitable share towards those common community facilities, and we're going to do some modelling around those other services where some properties don't actually receive them, so that we can look to separate that component of the general rate out. And then the UAGC is a separate issue again, which we have sort of tagged here, that we might like to have a look at changing where that currently sits. So is it 20% at the moment, Gary?
That's right.
And
20%.
we can go up to 30%.
That's correct. If I may, Madam Mayor, could I also get some clarification on what what services that the properties don't receive? Because a big distinction there is there are no boom gates or anything excluding anybody from using any of the public toilets or roading or footpaths or streetlights in any part of Napier, and that's the nature of this public good. And so that there will need to be some clarification or around that we can establish. Yeah. Yeah, and I guess, recognising that obviously every community member in Napier has access to every road in Napier and every footpath in Napier at some point in time, and depending on where they visit across the city. And it's more around acknowledging that in some of these communities, they don't have at their immediate vicinity, they don't have streetlights and footpaths and channel and curbing. So we still need to recognise that they have access to those types of facilities and services throughout the rest of the city, but just not on their doorstep.
Sorry.
So are we looking at a percentage type outcome here?
Yes, which is not going to be easy.
Just another question. Are we opening a can of worms here, because that would allow people in streets with no footpaths like on the hill or in Taradale and stuff to then, they might say they want that as well.
Except that the definition of the properties that actually qualify for this discount are if they are not currently connected or can be easily connected to city water and sewage.
Okay, so we would only pull it out of the rates for those properties?
Yes.
Okay, not all properties.
Councillor Price.
You know, I was a bit slow today picking up things. I'm not sure on this one what Nigel's saying. So Nigel could be paying $20 to go to the library, and his next door neighbour paying $22 to go. Is that the way it would?
And that's the way it is currently?
Yeah. So
yes.
I think it's actually a little...
specified on that.
That's what Nigel disagrees with.
Yeah, through you, Madam Chair. I think it's actually a little more extreme than that.
Oh,
it's not a $2 difference.
I'm sure it would be.
That's right. Apparently I'm funding you all for the library.
You've been a couple of times lately.
So just through the Mayor, so we're going to capture, for like a statement for each of these areas that you're wanting to talk about. And we're just going to put it up on the screen so we can all agree, if that's okay.
That's great.
And then any actions that we're requiring as a result of that part of your deliberation.
Yep.
So if you might have to just, again, reword what the decision of the council was from that discussion.
Yep. And just wait till they're ready.
Frankie knows all about. Can you tell you about them too?
Excuse me, Madam Mayor. Just one other point too, which I'd probably like to highlight as well, is just with this discussion, say, around the libraries. If you recall the submission made by Mr. Clark and his discussion today, he was talking about vertical equity. So typically, where you have a higher land value, you'll pay a higher proportion of the cost of that service. And so for the public library, if you've got a much higher land value, you'll pay a much greater proportion of that. Yeah.
Just let us know when you're ready.
So we're just going to take the number 19 one, and we'll start on a separate page. And then what we'll do is we'll get an agreement and a summary of what Kirsten said. So it was actually just further detail around some of the breakdown of those services. That
Yeah,
sit
so
within
a review of the general rate. To identify the proportion relating to common community facilities and services. Separating out those services which not all properties have access to. We could provide some examples.
Yeah, based on the agreed definitions.
But yes, perfect. Although we don't have those listed in the definition. Yeah, okay, perfect.
And need to be agreed definitions.
Yeah. And just add at the end of that, based on the yet to be agreed definitions.
Is park meant to be in there twice? You've got park and then parks and reserves in the first statement?
No. Is everybody happy that that articulates what we've discussed? Okay. So because we have touched on it already, I will bring up the UAGC now and open it up for conversation around whether we would like to review the 20%.
Yes.
Through the chair. Gary, directed to you, when we mentioned earlier sort of moving the UAGC, you were a bit hesitant. For what reasons would you be hesitant?
Okay, through you, Madam Mayor. As it is a fixed charge, usually when setting the rates, it would be the last lever we would look to adjust. As a fixed charge, a higher UAGC benefits properties with a higher land value. So typically you could imagine, say, rural properties in that mix, and disadvantages properties with a lower land value, such as those you see in lower socio-economic areas. It means that there's a greater general rates burden placed on those lower land value properties. So in looking at the UAGC and the land values just as a bit of an exercise, because we've currently got it at $375. I looked at increasing it to $425, so a $50 increase. I took a property in Maraenui, which has a land value of $175,000, and compared it against a half-hectare property in Bayview with a land value of $440,000. So the proposed total rates on that Maraenui property were originally $2,146. They increased by $18 to $2,164. For the Bayview property, which had proposed total rates of $2,309, it decreased to $2,291, which was just a pure chance. So the net change was positive $18 one way, negative $18 the other way. But what it does illustrate is the greater the difference between the land value, so the lower the land value or the higher the land value, the greater that change is going to be, because more of the burden of that charge is placed on the lower land value. Does that make sense? And when putting this together, one of the things we do have to consider is that if we do increase the UAGCs, it may impact some of those lower socioeconomic areas. And so, again, it's that balance. There's no easy answer to it, but that's part of the reason why we're often reluctant to move the amount too much.
Where do we sit with our UAGC percentage compared to other councils throughout the country? And I imagine there's probably quite a range, but just as a indication.
There is, and I do not have that information on me, I'm afraid.
But anecdotally, there has been some sharing of information with councils, and as Gary indicated, they do need some headroom at that top end. So there is some movement between the 20 and 25% generally across councils.
Okay. And I guess I would say increasing from 375 to 425 is quite significant, and I certainly would not be supportive of an increase of that degree. So again, would be keen to hear others' views of potentially something more within around a 3% or in that vicinity increase of the UAGC. I can see you're champing it a bit there, Councillor Simpson.
Sorry.
The aliens are landing.
Sorry, Madam Chair. I'm just trying to interpret what you just said, that you object to some people in lower socioeconomic areas incurring an $18 rates increase, whereas you're happy for people in the rural area, in the current proposal, to incur a $500 rates increase.
I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying that looking at the UAGC specifically, I think a $50 increase, which equates to a significant percentage across the board, I don't agree with. I think that would be close to taking us up to the 30% if we were to increase by that amount. Councillor Price.
I'd be interested to know what the percentage was if the House Maraenui had a zero, didn't go up, didn't go down.
Zero what?
So
Zero change.
Zero effect. So instead of it going up $18, it stayed where it is. So what would the rise be?
When you combine it with the other proposed changes, which would mean we couldn't model that until we'd made a decision on everything else.
Possibly going to go
That to
down.
me is closer to getting what percentage you'd go up, if any, that you're not.
Through you, Madam Mayor. Bear in mind, this is just one example, and so that would change from property to property. If all of them were the same land value, that would be an easy exercise to work with, but it's going to impact different properties in different ways depending on their land value. Yeah.
Councillor Wright.
I understand that we kept our UAGC low over time because we have quite a high, we have a low, we have a low wage economy here, and we have a lot of people that are not doing as well in our community compared to other communities around the country. So we'd kept it low for that reason. But what's become clear to me, listening to these submissions and talking to people, is that we're making assumptions about wealth based on land values, that's unfair, because there are people, and one lady that I talked to was very distressed. Living out in the country, yes, it's their choice to live out there, but their land values have gone up at a stupid rate, but their standard of living hasn't. Their income hasn't. And so the pressure that we're putting on them by raising rates based on a land value increase that they can't realise unless they sell their property anyway, is putting a lot of stress on people that we've got a perception of as being wealthy people, because they own a house that has a high land value. And that's just not the reality. So somehow it's at those extreme ends of everything that you clearly demonstrated with your example. It's those extreme ends that somehow, they're the hardest to get right.
Yeah.
And while I agree that keeping our UAGC low does, help with those that are less well off in our community, it's if we could adjust it a small amount and just get a bit more smoothing in there, I'd be really keen to look at it. Even if we just went to 22% or something, I'd just like to see some figures because, Yeah,
well summarised, Councillor Wright, and that was my thinking in terms of asking for looking at a small increase in that percentage.
If I may, Madam Mayor, just to note also that the UAGC the year before was $368, so it was increased by that $7, so we'd be looking at potentially increasing it again. But usually it is one of the final levers we'll look at to try and balance things out. And as you pointed out, it's difficult because we do have those exceptions and we do have those outliers that you can't always balance things or fix things for. It's tough.
So perhaps if we indicate that we would like to have that sitting there to use as a smoother or lever after we've modelled the other various things that we'll be deliberating on over the next day and a half. Just giving you a heads up that we may want you to run some numbers across that with some slightly higher percentages. Is everybody happy with that approach? Councillor Bogue?
I would actually prefer that it stayed at 20%. And while I totally agree with Councillor Wright's scenario of people living on a more expensive property, but, being pensioners or a single fixed income or whatever, in comparison with somebody living in a lower priced property who may or may not have more money coming in, I just think the person with the more expensive, more costly property has choices that the person living in a lower priced property doesn't have. So it's not, I would like to see, in terms of the UAGC, any increase would benefit those on the higher end of the property market than those at the lower. And I think, I agree with Councillor Wright that we live in a city with, low socioeconomic figures and low incomes. And, I wouldn't like to see it go up personally, but I'll go with the flow.
So, Councillor Crown?
Thank you. Yeah, I think both Councillor Wright and Councillor Bogue have really good points. However, I come at it from the perspective that the point of the review is for us to look at all the levers and all the options that we have available to us, and for us not to at least get some modelling and some further information on what an increase or an adjustment to the UAGC would look like, then I personally wouldn't feel like I'm doing my job properly. I think it's one of the options available to us and we should take it.
Okay, so if we leave it as noted that this is something that we would like to look at after the balance of the modelling has been done through other deliberations and see what the effect of a small increase would be. No. Oh, yeah.
You that one again, Keith?
Okay. I think we just need to be. And I think it's more, it's that we will look at a potential small increase after all other modelling has been completed to...
Well, that we would consider moving the UAGC to 22% if required.
Do we want to specify 22% specifically, or...
Because I don't think there's an appetite for a bigger move.
Minor adjustment.
Up to? Well, you might.
Yep. Everybody happy with that wording?
Yep.
Yeah. Great. So I'm conscious that it is 9 minutes away from 5, but I do think that there's one quick one on there that we could nail in probably less than 9 minutes, which is discussing the phasing over 3 years. And how do people feel about that?
Draw it out in case you find another one.
Yeah.
Is there a cap on that? Like, for instance, we phase anyone with a percentage increase over 20% over 3 years, or what's the parameters?
Yep, I think that's a good
Question.
Yeah, for
I
us.
was going to suggest similar on the basis that if we're looking at other levers, we may have mitigated some of the impact. So I think it's appropriate that we have that as an option, but I don't necessarily see it as necessary at the moment.
Yep.
Definitely.
A good one to answer when we've seen the modelling.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think from the Bayview point of view, I was thinking 5 years, but now with the change of done.
Yeah. I think we could set some parameters now, though. So I think we could say that if there was a percentage increase that we feel is onerous enough that it would justify it being phased, we can make that decision now without having to see the modelling. So whether that's 15% or 20% or 25%, essentially saying that if there was an increase of...
Just through the me, just to clarify, you'd be doing it as a whole.
As a whole? Okay,
couldn't
so
be
we can't
breaking it
actually
up.
put parameters or it makes it too complicated?
Otherwise, you've got there's swings and roundabouts on both sides, right? So it's actually the whole equation that you need to deal with.
Right,
So
actually,
it's a
yes.
phasing for everyone.
Yeah.
So the disadvantage will be for those that have been positively impacted at the moment. They won't receive their the upside until they get the 3 years, whereas those that are more negatively impacted would then take longer to obviously receive that. So it again is that two-sided equation, but we can't do it for those being most impacted. It'll be done as a whole.
As a whole.
With fairness, that would equalise it out over time. So that was part of why we were doing it.
That's correct, if I may, Madam Mayor.
Wrong for me to take advantage.
So just to speak to that point a little bit more, for the phasing, at the moment in our policy, it allows for 3 years. So it says, under the rates remission policy, council can smooth over 3 years where there has been a change in policy resulting in significant increases in rates. And so within that, as Adele just said, we should do it over the entire system because, as we discussed before, it is all interlinked. And it would create a distortive effect if we did it in isolated pockets. And I'd also recommend that we look at that purely for the differential with regards to general rates and not with some of the other things such as stormwater. That should be done just in a single go. Otherwise, it would be a very, very difficult task to try and achieve that.
Okay. So what I'm hearing, Gary, is that essentially in the existing proposal...
Within the existing policy,
there is already the option to phase over 3 years.
That's correct.
Okay, and so that has essentially flowed through to the proposal as well?
Whilst it wasn't mentioned in the recommendations, there was notation within the reporting. It's something I did overlook, but as an approach, it is a good one.
Okay,
Yep.
so essentially that is no change to current practice, and we would support that option being passed through into the new policy to be used if we deem it necessary. Okay. I see lots of nodding heads. Excellent. So it's
Just through the Mayor, I can note that we did a similar thing when we looked at the mix between residential and commercial, and we did phase it in over 3 years as well.
Yes.
So we've got some precedent with council.
Yeah, great. I do recall that happening. Excellent. I think we will quickly do one more, unless it looks like it's going to turn into a long-winded conversation. But number 2 on there, which I highlighted, was I would be quite keen to see some modelling around the commercial differential, which we currently have at 269%, and the proposal 0.3 or something, isn't it? 269 point something.
268.9, I think.
Yeah. And the proposal is to drop it to 250%, and I would be quite keen to see what 260% looked like and how that impacted across the other differentials. So open that up for a conversation.
I'd like to see how that compares to Hastings, because this is about our sort of economic area. And so I was wondering if we could compare a similar value property, so rather than the percentage that the differential that they apply in Hastings, because they have different levels of rates, what rates a similar value property would pay in Hastings versus in Napier. Is that doable?
Just with the Mayor, I mean, I think, we have to actually acknowledge that every entity will have its own rating system and policy. So if we start comparing things, you'll start to work out that it doesn't contain, say, for example, rubbish, or there's a whole lot of anomalies. And although it sounds a feasible option, I think there's too many underlying things that may cause you further issues if we start to go down that path.
Yeah.
If I may, sorry, Madam Mayor. Some of the things, for instance, pan charges. The way that sewerage is applied in Hastings is different to Napier. And so where it comes to doing a comparison against our own rates, we can certainly do that, but it is difficult when you've got a very different system in place. And so the pressure to meet those rates demands may be somewhere else in the system that we're overlooking because we're looking at one small part of the overall system.
Is anybody have any other thoughts or comments around us having a look at potentially adjusting that commercial differential? Councillor Crystal?
Just one thing that which Gary talked about is obviously the increase in the new valuations is very significant. So that difference is probably going to take them way back up again. So I don't know if that's...
And I guess I would comment that I don't think we want to be bringing the effect of the revaluation into our decisions around our policy. Yeah.
Through you, Madam Mayor, still 9% cheaper.
That's right. It is still a decrease on what they're currently paying. Okay.
What are they paying now?
268.9 or something to that effect. Yeah, something within a 0.01 of that. Okay, well, I will bring us to a conclusion then. Thank you, everybody, and we will be back from, I think it's 9 a.m. tomorrow morning to carry on our deliberations. Thank you to all the staff that have been involved today. It has been a big day for all of us. So, Councillor Bowe?
I just wondered if we're sending away our officers with a whole lot of homework to do before we see them tomorrow. It might be better for us to meet at 10 so that they're not spending the whole evening tonight doing it all.
I certainly don't have any expectations that we're necessarily going to have this modelling for us tomorrow. I don't expect staff to be off working all hours of the night.
And just through the Mayor, I would reiterate that some of these modelling issues are quite significant, and it will take some time, and it also may impact the timing of when you're going to implement this decision as well. So depending on, with any sort of policy change, the moment you poke one side, another pops out, and until you've actually done that modelling, you don't, because you've actually got 15 items on the list. So you're going to be sort of popping one thing and kind of not understanding necessarily the implications in another area. And so we would like the time to make sure that we can get all that right before we come back to council. But the big thing from my perspective is that they may cause some delays in when this can be implemented.
Yeah, and that's why I indicated earlier that we may well be adjourning tomorrow to a future date to give staff time to actually complete the modelling that we're asking them to do.
Yeah, and look, I don't have any problem with delays and waiting, because this is very significant piece of work that we're doing, and it has a significant impact on a portion of our community, and we need to get it right. So if it takes us a little bit longer to get it nailed down, I'd rather that we made the decision knowing that we'd explored every single possibility and got the best result that we could for everybody. So I commend you on not rushing us and taking the time to really look into it and do it properly. So thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Wright, and yeah, I couldn't agree more. This is absolutely vital that we do get the right outcomes for our community. So if it takes a little bit longer, then that's how it is. So yes, thank you everybody, and we will just close with our karakia. Kito kia ora, iwi, katoa, kia piki te ora, te kaha, te mana, ngā wā katoa, te hei, mauri ora. You can now go home.